Well, we've reached 11 o'clock. I declare it's kickoff time. So good morning, everyone. My name's Jonathan Warren. I'm the Chief Executive at Localis, the place-focused think tank. And thank you, everyone, for taking part and registering to attend the launch of today's Governance, Risk and Resilience Toolkit. This is the result, the long drawn-out result of a conversation I had with Ed Hammond back in the time pre-pandemic when pubs were open over a pint of cider in Victoria, when we were looking at some of the long-term implications of local government finance in terms of possible interventions and the best way for the sector to adapt to this. That was back in the halcyon days of 2018. So it's been, it seemed a good idea at the time, and I think although it's taken had quite an elephantine gestation period, it's been very much worth it given the times we find ourselves in now. After that, Ed's laid down the underpinnings for this excellent work, Decline and Fall, Understanding How and Why Local Government Fails. And eventually, with quite a considerable bit of help from our good friends and colleagues and guided by Ed, we're now able to present the Governance, Risk and Resilience Toolkit today, which is available from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny's website, and we'll be sending through a link to all participants after today's proceedings, so you can all dive in, see how it works and take part in it. Before handing over to Lord Kerslake, gratitude's always got to be the attitude, so a few very quick thank yous. Thanks again to Ed for guiding this through over the last couple of years. Thanks also to CFGS colleagues Jackie McKinley, Dr. Dave McKenna, Kate Grigg. From the Localis side, huge thanks to Joe Fyans, Zane Qureshi and Callan McLinden. And also, those Lord Kerslake will mention also, thanks to our project partners. Thanks very much to Scott Dorling and Helen Randall at Trowers and Hamlins for getting the ball rolling. Also friends at SIPFA, Alan Finch at Local Government Association, Sean Hanson at Local Partnerships, and Eileen Lyon at MHCLG. So, very quick words on housekeeping. Today's event is being recorded so we can put it on YouTube for watching afterwards. In terms of the debate, there is a Q&A box for everyone taking part today to put in their questions for us to put to our excellent lineup of panelists later. And very importantly, before I forget saying, here is the hashtag for those following on Twitter. Hashtag governance risk is the one you'll be using. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to pass over to Lord Kerslake. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and a warm welcome from me. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session as the chair of CFGS, as we're now called, Centre of Governance and Scrutiny. We have a really great panel for this launch, and let me just introduce them. Siobhan Jones is Director of Local Government and Communities at MHCLG. She tells me she's relatively recently joined the department, but has extensive experience in the civil service, working in the Department of Health, Treasury and Cabinet Office on various aspects of social policy, with a particular focus on health and social care. Helen Bailey, Chief Executive of the London Borough of Sutton. I won't say how many years we've known each other, Helen, but it's quite a lot. Helen has previously held Chief Exec roles at the London Borough of Islington and North Somerset, and of course has experience in housing, central and London government, having been in the Treasury and indeed in the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime, or MOPAC, as it's colloquially known as. And then thirdly, Councillor Marion Overton, MBE. Marion is Vice Chairman of the Local Government Association and elected leader of the LGA independent group of over 2,800 councillors in England and Wales, so a big number of councillors. She is group leader at both North Kesteven District Council and Lincolnshire County Council. And I think very appropriately, in the day after International Women's Day, she is Vice Chair of the Women's Local Government Society and an influential advocate for women in politics. So a very strong panel for the discussion later on as well. Now, look, as has already been said by Jonathan, we're launching the Governance, Risk and Resilience Toolkit. It's been a joint venture between CFGS and the think tank Localis. And it's been a labour of love, worked on for over 18 months now, involving all of the bodies that Jonathan referred to, MHCLG, SIPFA, LGA, local partnerships, Trowers and Hamlin. And again, I would like to add my thanks for all of those who've contributed. So it's been a shared effort to get this far. And I think it's come at a very important moment, really. Councils are pressed in all directions, financial, demographic and social, and of course from the huge challenges created by the pandemic. We know that coronavirus has been a big disruptor. It's been an accelerator of some things, but it most certainly has not been a leveler. Those most disadvantaged and vulnerable have been most affected by the pandemic. And that's brought with it some big challenges for councils. Now, we all know that good governance is the foundation stone for good councils. And we also know that when things go wrong, almost always behind the reasons where they've gone wrong is poor governance. Poor governance is at the core often of failings ultimately in organisations. So governance matters a huge amount. And I think we'd all say that during the pandemic, local government has actually exceeded many people's expectations. It's gone the extra mile, adapted and responded and delivered in ways that probably none of us thought were possible in extraordinarily short timescales. But if we're honest, we'd also say that it's had some impact and it's tested those places which have governance challenges already. The research we've got that's gone behind this toolkit really builds on those councils who've had problems in terms of governance, the learning that CFGS particularly, I think, has had in working with those councils, but it also builds on the best as well, where governance has been particularly strong. So it's learning not just from what hasn't worked, but what has worked. Above all, what we've created, I think, through this work is a practical framework that will help councils navigate through the difficult issues that they often face in terms of governance. And what I'd say is that both for elected members and indeed appointed members, there's always this question of where's the next risk, where's the next challenge coming from, how do we spot it early, and how do we ensure that our response is both proportionate to the problem and indeed appropriate to the risk and the challenge we're facing. And one of the things that is often difficult for councils is to find the time for reflection, the space in which to review and reflect what works well in terms of governance and what doesn't. It can be seen, for those who are more defensive about this, as somewhat navel-gazing and not getting on with the job. But we know unless you do this robust and honest reflection on how you work, the strengths and the weaknesses, gaps emerge between how you think things are working and how they are actually working. And therein lies the problem. And the challenge for CFGS, I think, all the way along, and I've now been chair, really, it was the first thing I took on when I stepped down as permanent secretary and head of the civil service, is that the councils who get this, the need for reflection and good governance, pick up the tools, but the councils who aren't as good often are the ones who are the last to take notice of this sort of report. So this is a different framework in many ways. It doesn't attempt to be a set of recommendations to be implemented as directed, nor is there some big compelling request to sign up to some form of document. That's not the approach that's been taken here. Instead, really, this report looks at what each individual member and officer might want to bring to the agenda of good governance, and provides them with a toolkit to help them do that. So it's not about necessarily just the leaders of councils or the chief execs, it's about all the councillors and indeed all the officers looking at it and seeing how can we use this toolkit to improve the way in which we govern. It's also not about a lot of law or best practice in terms of formal processes. There's quite a lot of that about already, I think. It is actually much more about roles and relationships, and in particular, behaviour and culture. And I would have to say, having done many peer reviews and many investigations myself, culture and behaviours are often the biggest issues. They're the least understood sometimes by organisations, but they're often the biggest drivers of challenges in relation to governance. So I think it's pitched it right to not focus on simply the issues of process and formal decision making, and spend a lot of time thinking about how behaviours work. And in many ways, it fits with the sort of work I did myself as head of the civil service around the so-called accountability system statements that each department was asked to draw up when I was there. One of the things I think the toolkit does is to provide a common language so that when we use certain words, we all have a good and clear understanding of what we mean by them. I think, again, that is crucial because when we have different views of what the language means, we're more likely to make mistakes. At the core of the toolkit is a set of 7 governance and cultural characteristics which councillors and officers can use to explore their own personal experiences as part of working in and serving local government. And this, in a sense, focuses on the thing I said earlier, which is about individual responsibility. And it helps, I think, unearth the sorts of risks and challenges that the individual and indeed the organisation can face. It also, I think, works for senior officers as well. So although I don't think it's only about senior officers, I think there's value in it for the council's principal statutory officers, head of paid service, section 151, and the monitoring officer, who can draw on it, I think, to help deal with some of the complex and cross-cutting challenges that they face in terms of governance. Now, this is my view as somebody who's been a supporter and champion of this toolkit. The test will be how much you, listening into this launch, actually get out and use the document. So I would say do actively use it and give us feedback on how well it works for you as a toolkit. Does it provide the kind of support that you need, really? Because today's the launch. What really matters is how it's followed up across the country with individual councils, individual councillors, and indeed individual officers. So it's a start. I think it's a great start. It's a practical tool. Do take it up and do give us feedback on how it's working. With that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, which is Siobhan. Over to you, Siobhan.
Hello. Thank you very much, and huge thanks for inviting me to be part of this event and on such a distinguished panel. As mentioned, I'm relatively new to the world of local government. This is week 6 in this role, but I've found it fascinating. It's a return, actually. My first job, our start of my career was working in the London Borough of Sutton. So it's a huge privilege to be on the panel with Helen today. But although I'm relatively new to this world, I've already been hugely impressed by the breadth and the depth of the matters that council are managing, and in particular through these really challenging times, which makes governance even more important, as has already been said. And I hope I wouldn't have to say it to this room, but it's a hugely important subject. It may not be the thing that gets the headlines day in, day out, but it's absolutely vital for any organisation to deliver what it wants to deliver, and ultimately leads to better outcomes for our residents. So which is why I'm so excited by this framework and toolkit, because it puts some real sort of rigor around it and the tools for those common conversations that have been referred to. And I think now is a good time to have these discussions. You know, it has been an extraordinary 12 months. And I don't say that thinking it's all over and calm now. Of course, it's still very busy. But I think, you know, local government deserves huge credit for the resilience it has shown in delivering in these really difficult times. It's delivered across a wide range of areas, new things, new relationships, new partnerships, and that can bring challenges. But I do think now is a good time to sort of reflect, and for leaders and officers to reflect on their experience, how it's worked in their organisation, how it's worked with their partners. And I think this toolkit provides an excellent framework for those conversations and a real stimulus for that. And one of the strengths, I think, has been referred to, it's, you know, accessible to a wide range of people. It's not just about the chief exec asking the questions or the leader asking questions. That I really like the comment of, you know, if you're a council officer or a councillor, you also have a responsibility for good governance in how you go about your role day to day. And I think that's a really important emphasis. And I really like the way this is being described as that sort of continuous conversation and continuous reflection. We know, you'll know better than me, that governance issues are not straightforward, and it can be hard to identify the areas that can most benefit from improvement. So having that shared language, having that shared understanding, and having the characteristics and the behaviours alongside each other, I think makes this toolkit particularly powerful in helping support some of those conversations. And I think what's really helpful here is the sort of emphasis on individual councils thinking through their own issues. So it's not as has been said, it's not that prescriptive one size fits all. It's helping promote that conversation at that local level. But clearly, we obviously have an interest in central government. You know, one of our overarching aims is to ensure a sustainable and effective sector and delivering high quality public services, which is important to all of us. So we have a strong interest in helping the sector be resilient and creative in delivering those services and thinking through for itself of how it could improve and support each other in that sort of sector-led improvement, which is one of the reasons why we were so keen to support the development of this toolkit. And that sector-led improvement model is incredibly helpful, and I know the LJ has played a hugely important role in this, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. And there have obviously in the past been some areas where central government has had to get involved, but fortunately these are really rare, and it's not that long ago since the PACs were commenting that local authorities have a good overall track record with governance arrangements and they're generally robust. So I think it is worth sort of taking that step back and thinking, you know, there's a lot to celebrate here and there's a lot of good out there. But we do know it's not universal, and I think what is really interesting is there is a clear message coming through of where there have been challenges, governance plays a real part in that. Last summer, MHCLG published some lessons learned documents on past and current interventions. And I think it's really striking that the analysis that we published back then suggests that despite the unique circumstances which led to the interventions, each local authority exhibited some shared characteristics of weakness in governance. And those really chime with the themes that are in this framework. So, for examples, there's something about being clear about officer and council roles and good relationships at that level. There was definitely something around ensuring effective scrutiny and transparency. And there's this point around the lack of awareness in some cases of what's really going on, and an acceptance of the need for improvement, which I think is a really interesting common theme between what we looked at back then and the framework today. So I'm really pleased that this governance framework that you're promoting today brings together those characteristics in a really clear, accessible way, and has the behaviours that sit alongside that will hopefully really help people trying to work through these complicated issues for themselves. So in conclusion, I'd like to echo the thanks that have already been made. I think this is an excellent piece of work. A lot of thinking and work has gone into it over the last 18 months. So thank you to everybody who's been involved. And we all have an interest here in helping councils be as effective as they can be. So I think this will be a really valuable addition to what you've already got out there, and will help you embed really strong and positive governance and leadership cultures in your organisations. So I would just really echo that call to use it, think through what it means for you, and help make sure that we can deliver the sort of best services for residents. I look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion, so I will pass back. But thank you.
Thanks very much, Siobhan. Thank you for that contribution. I just would observe on your point about interventions, which I've been involved in a number of, just how damaging and expensive they are compared to the investment that could be made in preventing them, actually, I think. So absolutely endorse your point there. We'll move on to our second speaker, which is Marion Overton. I've worked with Marion as the president of the Local Government Association, and she is a terrific force for good in local government. So very interested to hear what you've got to say, Marion.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a great delight to have this opportunity. Thank you for that. I'm Marianne Overton. I'm Vice Chairman of the Local Government Association, leader of the independent group on the Local Government Association. I lead at the District Council, but not at the county just currently, so just to be clear on that. So thank you very much for the very kind introduction that you gave. I'm very pleased to be here today and to support this important work. And a very big thank you to you for taking it up and really making such a substantial piece of work that will be really important for our councils. So thank you. The governance affects everything that councils do. And local government in many ways is one of the best governed parts of the public sector. And you might say, I would say that. And yes, I do. The councils have their own democratic mandate, and we're locally accountable to residents very directly. Elected members have common law responsibilities to balance the needs of taxpayers and residents. Councils are governed by written constitutions. Meetings by law are carried out in public, and that means that decision making is transparent, and I think very much more so than some other parts of the public sector. There's a strong system of checks and balances, and that includes duties upon certain officers as being described, and also to report to the council in certain circumstances on annual local audit. All of that goes not just through a committee, but directly to full council to make sure that it is in public. And one of the things that we have to report on every year is best value judgment that the audit of the accounts has shown. So that's quite a substantial amount of transparency and accountability, which I think is well recognised and well supported. So there is a great tradition of probity encouraged through such measures as registers of gifts and hospitality, whistleblowing policies. Councils and councillors are bound by a whole range of codes of statutory guidance governing various aspects of their activities, including transparency code and the statutory guidance on consultations. And councillors are bound, of course, as we all are, by the code of conduct. So councils invariably, not only do they use the statutory framework, but they actually supplement them as well with local practices and local standards, standing orders. And in that way, it's very much embedded in the working of every aspect of any council. So we've had significant cuts in funding, as you know. We had a reduction of 10 billion a year from central government. So that funding since 2010 is significantly reduced, and that does put pressure on councils to make savings. So some of those, and you might think of governance as not a very visible one sometimes. At first, people see it as something that's maybe not quite so transparent, not so visible rather, I should say, not in your face. And so that does tend to be a problem if it comes to looking for making savings. We're talking about democratic services, legal departments, internal audit and scrutiny teams are all very much important parts of governance, which we need to maintain. And the impact of that is often all of those workings are not always visible, and we shouldn't assume that good governance is something that happens. It needs work and it requires resources. It also requires a political culture that is prepared to allow and embrace the scrutiny and to make changes based on that. And the Local Government Association Sector-Led Improvement Programme gives the LGA a unique insight into the way councils work and are governed. And we've been really pleased to advise that work today towards this toolkit to advise on that. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to support the work that's been done with Localis and the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny at this point. So the relative effectiveness of local authority governance is evident when things go wrong, because it's public and people know about it. And that's good, but it does need to be kept in proportion, because you can get the wrong impression. The fact is, when you consider the scale and scope of what councils do, these issues are remarkably rare. Most of local government is conducted in really good order, high standards, and an environment of respect and civility. That's not to say that issues don't arise, and it's important that councils have a clear understanding of what good governance looks like and be very self-aware of how practices measure up. And that's why this toolkit and this report will be really useful. It highlights some of the issues that can arise and addresses both councillors and officers, how they can provide them with tools so that they can deploy, make sure that the work remains of the absolute highest standards. There are at the moment a few high-profile cases which you would have heard about where things have not worked in the best public interest, and those are public. So the three that we just to mention are the London Borough of Croydon, Nottingham City, and Northampton Borough Council. They both recently they have received reports in the public interest from their auditors about concerns raised on the governance. So these will need tackling, and they have got action plans and strategies and really a lot of work going in from the Local Government Association and others to make sure that they can be pulled round and actually put all these things right. And sometimes as a subsequent, these councils will no doubt shine as beacons of perfection, at least excellence in their field. So it's important to note that these reports of public interest do come out, and they have all been responded to very robustly and positively. The LGA is working with each of them to secure an improvement journey. So in general, the number of councils that have where an intervention has had to happen is relatively very small, and it's hard to identify any pattern because the numbers are small. But this report does identify some important issues. For example, as we mentioned, the culture of good governance, that it's recognised by all and that respect is given to people who make decisions and to everybody involved in doing their job correctly. So it's not just enough to have processes. Members and officers be enabled, motivated and encouraged to really make these processes work. The leader and chief executive partnership remains critical, but the toolkit also makes reference to an important trio of officers dubbed the Golden Triangle, comprising of the head of paid service, chief finance officer and the monitoring officer. So these are officers with specific personal statutory responsibilities for aspects of governance. And it's clearly important that these officers are well qualified, experienced, and work well together as a team. They also need to work with the elected members and alongside elected members to deliver the council's policies without having to exercise any stopgap powers. For example, the finance officer has a statutory duty to issue a section 114 report to the council if that council is unable to balance its budget. So although inevitably the work of the executives, the mayors, leaders, cabinets receives most of the attention, we should not overlook the work of really important work of frontline councillors in the way they conduct themselves and in particular in the work they do in the council, not least those who serve on scrutiny committees, audit committees, and the standards committees to have an oversight in the way the council does its business. So governance is indeed not just a matter for leaders and statutory officers, but very much for all councillors and officers. And I really welcome this toolkit and this report from Localis and the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, and that will be a vital and valuable tool for councils. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion, for that contribution. Particularly kind of noted your sort of passionate advocacy of the high standards often that exist in local government, which I think is right. But also your last point about good governance being a responsibility of all councillors and officers, not just the statutory officers. So powerful points. Look, we'll move on to our third speaker, which is Helen Bailey, who is Chief Executive of Sutton, but also on the board of CFGS with me. So over to you, Helen.
So thank you very much, Bob, and it's great to be on this panel today, and thank you to colleagues. I'd like to start off by saying I'm really pleased that we've got this report produced by Localis and CFGS. I'm a real believer in the importance of these things coming from the sector and produced by people who are part of the sector, rather than being about external regulation. Bob alluded to just how long in the tooth I am, although I didn't mean that to be insulting to you, Bob. But I think I still have somewhere in my brain an audit commission slide from about 1990 about the respective roles of officers and members. And the point of saying that is, what we had then was something we could refer to, which came from an authoritative body in which we were all to some extent invested. And I think this report goes a long way to helping us have something else of the same sort. That said, I'm both going to be very, very positive about the report and a little bit challenging, because I think somebody ought to be, and it might as well be me. So the report talks about the 3 stages of governance, about anticipating, managing and adapting to the circumstances you're in. And of course, that's absolutely right. And it talks about the 7 characteristics and the 7 principles of good governance. And I can't argue with a word of it. So my challenge is essentially benign. And I completely agree, particularly with what Marion was saying about the importance of relationships between officers and members and the chief executive and leader. We all know if those relationships work well, and that's not uncomplicated, because that both needs to be a relationship of trust, but it needs to have a bit of tension in it too. We talk about needing to speak truth unto power and at the same time not having any surprises and sharing your secrets with each other. These things are not uncomplicated, particularly in councils which are contested and where you have also significant opposition groups with whom you also have to have relationships of trust. You know, that's the exciting challenge of the day job in local government, isn't it? So my first point really is about governance and politics. And some of the principles in this report would apply to any organisation anywhere. But actually, the governance of politics and the politics of governance are the legitimate business of local government. And governance is going to be politicised in local government because everything is. And that's right. It's not right when it gets completely out of hand, but it's right that it should be contested and thought about. And it's also right that those of us charged with governance should be respectful of the politics and the politicians that we work with. And that said, I think the other part of this is, I agree completely, and Marion supported the point, that every elected member has a role in this, but we can't expect elected members to be professionals. That isn't to say they're not professional, but the point about our elected members is that they are representatives and that they should and could come from all and any walks of life and be motivated by almost any concern about their locality to take on the role. And our job as those interested in governance is not to put them off by telling them that they need to, you know, complete 3 CIPFA courses and get an MBA in governance before they can take up that role. And I say that with my tongue slightly in my cheek, because what I observe somewhat wryly over my time in local government is that we've done more and more of that. People get elected because they're concerned about where the zebra crossing is outside their school, and we tell them that's an operational matter and there's no time to deal with that, and what they should be thinking about is the strategy for the next 10 years of an organisation whose budget is only certain for the next 2. And then we wonder why they get a bit fed up and go off and do something else for the rest of their lives. So I do think we need to have a real respect and understanding for those people that we want to get excited and come into local government. And some of that, and no offence to Siobhan, is also because there is a little conspiracy, and local government is part of it, a conspiracy of Maoist self-flagellation. So we've talked about councils that need intervention, we've talked about the problems of that, and we're quite, we feel the need to do that quite a lot in local government. And government sometimes encourages us to. I sometimes think that government is rather busy taking, to use the biblical analogy, the mote out of local government's eye, while ignoring the beam in its own. And like Bob, who I seem to have followed, but less illustriously in many places, I went to work in central government and was frankly surprised. I'd come from being a chief exec in a local authority and was now a senior official, to discover that some of the governance issues that I took for granted were my responsibility in a local authority situation simply didn't exist. Simply didn't exist. And not to say that it is not well governed, but it is very differently governed, and some of the rules that are applied to us in local government don't apply in the same way. So there is a challenge there, and sometimes I like to sort of take that mirror and show it in the other direction. And I don't think we in local government should overly collude with that bit of flagellation that sometimes comes from the centre. So hopefully that's a little bit controversial. Then I'd like to say, actually, the other challenge to all of this is to adapt it to the different circumstances of different local authorities. We don't live in a one-size-fits-all world. Marion is a member of both unitary and a county. I'm part of a London borough. We have a committee system. Most local authorities these days don't, but we do. And that means that you do scrutiny in a very different way. And I think the fact that we do have different ways of approaching things and different structures is healthy and adds to the variety and richness of local government. And we should cherish that, and we should think thoughtfully about how we apply these principles to those circumstances. And then I suppose my final challenge is about the reality of life. Because when to give you a little vignette of the reality of my life, and we've all talked about the pandemic and the extra pressures that we are all suffering from, and some of the capacity issues of local government. So it was slightly wryly that very late last night on my train home, I read the phrase that appears here that says, "Directors and senior decision-making councillors have the time and space to think clearly." And I thought, aha, yes, obviously, that's what I'm doing sitting on the train at 11 o'clock in the evening. I'm finding the time and space to think clearly about what I'm about to do tomorrow. And the point is not that we don't or that we shouldn't, but that actually good governance is not just about doing all of the ideal things. It's about delivering the stuff we have to do every day. So throughout the pandemic, we've been getting on with, I don't know, whatever it is, running hubs, doing test and trace, worrying about surge testing, doing whatever else it is we have to do. None of which were our day job beforehand. All of which, if we were instituting them as programs of work, we would have sat down, thought very carefully about, and probably decided they were all too difficult. But we haven't, we've got on with it. And that is the reality of our lives. So as we apply governance to what we're doing, we also need not to get overly fixated on the process, but we also need to think about the outcome. I will never forget the colleague who, when recruiting somebody one day, told me that they'd offered the job to the person they thought could do least damage. And you think, yeah. And when I questioned this, they said, well, we had to take the best available person on the day. And you think that is the process, getting ahead of the outcome. Why are we recruiting somebody who we think can do relatively little damage? Let's not recruit anybody if that's the best we can find. Anyway, but sometimes the process takes over, and part of governance is making sure that it doesn't. So, but that said, the bit of governance advice that I still cherish in my heart, which is somewhere in behind all of what is here, is the importance of really good adult conversations. It's reflected in what this report says about relationships. It's reflected in what the report says about culture. So I think that what this tells us and what this fleshes out for us, that to have good governance, you have really good culture, you have really good conversations, and you have really good colleagues working together, understanding that what we do is important as well as the way we do it. And that said, I am really, really grateful to my colleagues in CFGS and in Localis for bringing this issue up to the top of my mind and hopefully that of everybody engaged in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Very strong set of points you made there to get the conversation going. Particularly noted things around the relationship between governance and politics, the expectations on councillors that we can reasonably ask of them, really. The need not to self-flagellate, I think, is, I've never seen local government as Maoist, but it's possible that we might have finally adopted that political philosophy. We'll see. And particularly also your point about one size doesn't fit all, and in the end we have to deliver really what we our services. So all powerful points, I think. We now move into the discussion, and keen to pick up the Q&As that have been contributed so far, but also encourage those listening in and watching to add questions as well. And the way we're going to do this, because you can't ask us the questions directly, this is the power of doing things remotely. The power is entirely in Jonathan's hands now to tell us which questions we should all be considering. So over to you, Jonathan, to highlight the key questions.
Many thanks, Bob. Yes, so I have the power. So I'm going to go through some of the questions down there, sort of group them in. And what I'll do is I'll read them out, and please, Marianne, Helen, Siobhan, unmute and respond to them as you see fit. Firstly, one anonymous attendee has asked, would you recommend the toolkit is read and acted upon by members of a council ethics and standards committee? I think the answer has to be very affirmative, yes please, and all council ethics and standard committees. A question from Andy Pike. He asks, how much is local governance failure due to rogue elements or bad behaviours rather than any systemic dysfunctions within highly centralised arrangements? He also asks, how have fiscal stress and uncertainty since 2010 made the governance challenges more complex and difficult to manage, even for the most ably governed? And I'll group that in with another question. How do you avoid defensive behaviours taking over the culture of a council to the point that staff or elected members don't feel able to challenge? So, Marianne, Helen, Siobhan, please come in any order you wish to.
Marianne, perhaps you start.
Thank you. Thank you, certainly. Those are really good questions. I think I want to particularly pick up about how to avoid offensive behaviour taking over. I think that's really important one for us because it involves everybody. They always say that for evil to triumph, others have to stand by. And this is the point. I think when somebody witnesses something that they're not happy with, I think it's really important that everybody, even whether it's the you know, I don't know about high or low, but you know, whoever it is in the council, anybody should actually stand up and say, actually, I don't think the public would be happy to hear that. I think it's just really simple, bring things back down, because it is important that we ourselves respect each other before we can ask respect from others. And I think I'll leave the other parts of the question to somebody else.
All right, Helen, do you want to come in?
I'll try a bit. So, of course, there's going to be defensive behaviour in a political environment. And I think Marianne's point is well made, but it's really much harder than it sounds. Because if you're calling something out, which is going on in your council, some part of that may be about political disagreement, and some part of that may be about a disagreement about the governance process that's arrived at it. It's often very hard to tell the difference between the two. And certainly, you know, I see complaints which tell me that all kinds of things are very terrible. And sometimes at the heart of those, there is a simple political disagreement. And we have to be reasonably sophisticated about that. That doesn't make it wrong. It's a good challenge. It's just a different challenge. So, and what I think the question from Andy Pike is all about is how do you manage all of those tensions in a really challenged world where you're trying to do a lot of stuff with not enough money or time to stop and take everybody along with you. And actually, you're never going to take everybody along with you, because the nature of local government is it's political, and therefore it's contested. So there will always be 2 points of view, at least, on everything you do. So it's about navigating the way through difficult situations with as much good governance as possible, and recognising the legitimacy of political challenge and finding the appropriate place for that. Now, sometimes as officers we get that wrong. Sometimes members will overstep the mark. It's recognising those two things, I think, that's really important.
Siobhan, did you want to come in?
Just to briefly add, I'd echo that, and obviously less close to the detail of how this works in practice, but I do think what it sort of brings out is some of the complexity of this, and Andy's question around, is it due to rogue elements or bad behaviours? My suspicion is it's relatively that straightforward. You know, in some ways wish that it was. It's actually a combination of different things that Helen and Marianne have described, and I think that's where the framework helps set out some of the richness of that and going through that, rather than trying to attribute it to one or two rogue elements that it would be easier to get rid of. I think it's a complicated set of dynamics going on, and it needs to be tailored to that local circumstance in the way that has been described.
Yes, just quickly add one point before we come on to other questions. Sorry, no, Marianne, you wanted to come in. You come in first.
Sorry, yes. Just a thought, I think, further from that is that it's also the way we deal with complaints when they come forward. We do have to welcome and embrace complaints, because they do tell us something needs changing. Either it's the communication or it's the actual issue isn't right. And I think when councillors realise something's wrong in their patch, they have to check if it's something that can be just dealt with, or if it can be, if it needs a change of policy. But these are the kind of frustrations that can lead to bad behaviour, because people are just, they don't know what else to do. You know, I've tried everything and still it's not right. So I think it is very much about the way the organisation treats complaints and issues raised, and recognises, embraces and changes to improve as a result.
Yeah, just to add 2 quick points myself, really. I do think it is driven often by frustration rather than malice, but nevertheless, there has to be a way of calling it out, even if it happens subsequently. Ideally, you do it in the moment, but it does need to be called out. And the reason why I think it does is because what starts off as, if you like, justifiable or it's perceived justifiable bad behaviour becomes the norm. You know, in other words, it might have been driven by frustration of a moment, but it becomes the way things are done, and that's then embedded in the culture. And that's why I feel it's really important to challenge, even if you can understand why people have been frustrated and then therefore behaving the way they do. I think Ed makes a good point in the chat, though, about the value here of common language, actually, to understand what's going on and know what we're talking about. But let me pass back to Jonathan for another question.
Many thanks, Steve. I'll take sort of a trio of named questions. Councillor Janice Long asks, should there be a minimum resource for scrutiny? She says, we have 2 scrutiny committees which skim a topic but don't go into detail, and with agendas set in advance often fail to be topical. Helen Randall from Trowers and Hamlins asked the panellists, do you feel there's hope for the future in terms of learning from the toolkit and fewer interventions? How do you think members could be best encouraged to engage with these recommendations? And third and final, from Jo Sargent, she asked, we've got another one further down the Q&A, do panel members have a view about the committee model of governance and how it might be adapted to, say, serve a large UK city? Over to you in any order.
Okay, let's do the Siobhan first. Let's reverse the order. Siobhan, do you want to come in first?
Yes, very happy to. I think on the question around hope for the future, yes, I am hopeful. I think the fact that there's been a sort of large level of agreement around these principles, the fact that as referred to before, I think there's actually an awful lot of really, really good practice in this area. So we shouldn't underestimate that. I don't want to fall into Helen's trap of trying to encourage the sector to beat itself up. That's absolutely not about this. So I am hopeful that there's people out there who want to do better and are already doing a good job, but how to improve. And this toolkit, I think, hopefully will be welcomed by those people. And as Lord Kerslake alluded to earlier, there's, we don't want to be in a space of lots of interventions. That's not good for anyone. So I do remain very hopeful that by working through some of these issues, by thinking about the relationships, trying to think through the difficult things that we are, with this common language, then I think that can make a real difference. And however difficult the last year has been, it does provide that platform and that opportunity to open up some of these conversations again. But I might leave others to talk in more detail about sort of this minimum resource elements and others. That's a little bit more relevant to those who've lived and breathed it.
Yeah, and indeed the question on the committee system, which I'll make a comment on in a minute, but I'll come to Helen next. Oh, you're on mute, Helen.
The curse of our age. I was going to start with, well, I wasn't going to start with it, I was going to end with it, but you're going to start with it. I'll say, of course it can work in a big city, because both Bob and I started working for something called the GLC, which entirely had committees, and I became a committee clerk, and the most useful set of things I ever learned. So I think you can make anything work, is my point. On the scrutiny board, to be a little less flippant about it, I'm not a great fan of minimum resources, but I am a big fan of thinking about what you're trying to achieve through scrutiny. So I worked, as Bob said, for the Mayor of London, running the police and crime operation for him. And that's all about scrutiny. And I spent a lot of time saying to people, scrutiny isn't shoving two fingers in somebody's eyes and saying, you got it wrong. Scrutiny is about making sure that something can work. So it seems to me that everybody in London, to take that example, which is no longer part of my day job, has a vested interest in the success of the Metropolitan Police. They don't want to wait till they have some God almighty failure and say you got that wrong. So it's the same thing in councils, isn't it? To my mind, it works best when scrutiny looks at something you might be about to do and does what government would call pre-legislative scrutiny, and really thinks through the pros and cons. You can do it with less politics, with more thought and better results, rather than just sitting back saying, I thought that worked well, I thought that didn't, and then just having an argy-bargy about something you can't change. So I don't know if that helps. And Helen, how intimidating to be asked questions by Helen Randall. Yes, of course, I'm hopeful. We're ever hopeful in local government. And Bob's point about interventions, it's about scrutiny, but it's also about recognising that there's a whole range of cultural things going on, and it's always better if we can help each other first rather than wait till it's gone badly wrong. Thank you.
Okay, Marion.
Thank you. The point about scrutiny I'll pick up in particular. It is very important, and it's often a less senior officer that gets scrutiny, and I think that's important. I would ask councils to look for balance. If we are really using scrutiny as a way of developing policy, looking at the issues that have been raised by the public, which is why we've got straightforward ordinary members picking those issues up, putting them onto scrutiny, setting up task and finish groups, which means that you've got a really in-depth look at the subject, and then putting recommendations which are respected and accepted by the executive. I think that's when it works. If there's a break in any of those, then obviously it doesn't work, and you're then missing out on skills and talents being effective. And so I think that's important. There aren't really big issues. If you look at climate change, we've all got to have strategies, and we've got recovery from COVID, both economically and in terms of the communities, mental health issues, and environmentally. So we've got a huge range, really big subjects. Our scrutiny committees should be working their socks off at the moment. There's so much to be looking at to try and develop ways in which the councils can do better to really support their residents. So I think that's how members should be more engaged, making sure they are driving the agenda, they're bringing the changes, and whatever resources are needed to balance what's going on needs to be put in place. On the committee structure, again, I think it's on the executive. I did suggest for the executives that they were always cross-party to match the membership, and that they had a duty to discuss and engage with membership of their council, so their committee members effectively. And I sometimes feel that they feel themselves as a separate body in some cases, but actually it would be, to my mind, really good if they were all answerable very directly to the members of the council, and therefore able to really drive forward the things so that you get a collective advantage of all of the skills and talents in the council chamber. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Marion. 3 quick points from me, because I want to make sure we've got time for some more questions. As Helen alluded to, on the committee versus cabinet scrutiny model, I've done both, but in a large city, so I have a sense of how they work, and both can be symbols of good governance and indeed examples of bad governance. I don't think it flows from which of those models you use, and both can work in big cities. I would say the cabinet scrutiny model, though, encouraged a more collective form of decision making and leadership in what I saw, actually working across the services and issues in a place than we saw some of the time with the committee model. And I think the question is, can you make, if you are going to go down the committee model, you have to think very hard how you retain that cross-cutting collective governance. And ironically, local government, in my view, got a lot better at that than central government did, which still is absolutely stuck in many occasions in departmental silos. We have to be honest about it. So that's a kind of slightly provocative comment on governance, I think. Just one other point I'd make, though, it's about the positive value of scrutiny. I had the great pleasure of being at 24 Public Accounts Committee meetings with Margaret Hodge as the chair, and she was pretty formidable. But one of the things you observed there was how often what you were doing essentially was a defensive game. You were essentially defending an action or decision, often years ago, maybe even before you took up your role. And it's the in-flight thing that you can do on scrutiny that's often the most powerful, which is to say, how are we doing on this issue, not how did we do? And I think that is where scrutiny can be incredibly powerful, or even, as we've just heard, before you make the decision, so you're not locked into a defensive position before you even start. Shall we move back to Jonathan? I think we're probably going to have time, Jonathan, for perhaps one last question, maybe, and then we'll need to close. Indeed, we're running out of time. I'll put this one to Marianne, because you requested you want to answer it. It's a very good one. Have not heard mention of governance in relation to local democracy or community citizens, i.e. the importance of democratic local governance. What about this? How can communities, citizens come to shape and own their own local council constitutions? Marianne, your views first.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's about the public seeing how things are running, and if they can see that things aren't quite right, rather than that just being put aside, that's actually a point that the councillors need to take forward. Does our constitution need changing to take account of this issue? Do the processes need changing? But I think it's very much about making sure that we are much more engaging. We can have citizens' juries, we can have a whole much more engagement within scrutiny, so that we are actually bringing in the public to really make their voices known, because they bring such a wide diversity of experiences in our communities. And that's what helps us make the right decisions for all.
Thank you, Marianne. Final comments on that from Helen and Siobhan quickly. Thank you.
Okay. Go on, Siobhan. Sorry.
Yeah, all I was going to very much echo. I think there's it's making sure sort of communities and citizens have an understanding of how they can raise issues and get them to people's attention, because I think it is a hugely additional voice and can spot things that perhaps are not getting picked up through other routes. So earlier, the sort of issue of complaints was mentioned, and making sure people understand what's their avenue for flagging concerns so that it actually can get picked up and not buried in amongst other bits and pieces.
So I will be very slightly controversial, Jonathan, and say I think we ought to understand what is democracy and what is accountability. I never forget somebody once saying to me who ran a voluntary service organisation that they had 90 organisations, each of whom had an average of 100 members. So that was more people than had elected the council. So I should listen to them before I should listen to my councillors. Whatever the logical construct of that was, my councillors were accountable for the decisions. So I think the art form that we're engaging is, how do you engage with people? How do you understand what's going on in the community? And how do councillors, in making their decisions, show that they've understood it, but maybe that they don't always agree with it? And that's where the accountability sits. It isn't just doing what a majority of people who've chosen to sign a petition tell you to do. But it is a controversial and difficult topic, which sadly we don't have time for. So Bob, over to you.
And I think we've run out of time now, unfortunately. Thank you to Jonathan for bringing questions. I would want to thank the panel, Siobhan, Marion and Helen, I think, for a really great discussion. Just to say, we haven't unfortunately answered all the questions, but I know they'll be picked up by CFGS and Localis to come back on. There is a connection between another report on today called Levelling Up Devo, an independent panel that's looked at how we move forward on devolution in this country. Because actually, if we're good at the governance, if we are seen to be well governed as a sector, that's part and parcel of the argument for why more powers and more funding should come to local government, it seems to me. So thanks to the panel. Jonathan, is there anything you wanted to say by a word?
Yeah, firstly, thank you to the panel. Thank you to yourself, Lord Kerslake. Thanks to everyone for registering, taking part and contributing so richly. Summing up, we will send out a link to the toolkit on the CFGS website and the material surrounding that, and also a copy of a link to a YouTube session so you can watch this on catch up later. Thank you everyone for taking part at the Carls and CFGS. It's been very worthwhile. We look forward to advancing this agenda with colleagues in the coming months and years. So thank you very much. Take great care. And yes, keep in touch on this agenda. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.